I mean, I think Icebergs being open and seeing staff who've struggled to get back out there and get dropped into a Bondi summer that I'm really excited about. I mean, I think summer in Bondi this year feels like it's going to be pretty special. And the menus and the wine lists and things are tuned up and the staff are ready to go.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Just recently, Sydney racked up 100 days of lockdown in a row, but with restrictions beginning to ease, a light has emerged at the end of a very long tunnel. Although many restaurants switched to an at-home model, front of house staff, in most cases, have had to sit on the sidelines and wait until they can work their magic on the floor again. What impact has this had on the front of house profession? The wait staff, the bussers, the sommeliers, the hosts. James Hurd is from Icebergs Dining Room and Bar in Sydney. James, how are you?
Yeah, very well, and thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. You've had a very long lockdown. What's it been like? Have you been busy during this time?
Yeah, look, I have been really busy. I guess I had a lot of projects on the go last year that got pushed back to this year. And then the ones from this year are getting pushed back. So I'm really coming out of the blocks pretty hot, you know. And even though we've been in lockdown a long time, I mean, it's a great time to be speaking to you because it's almost like the Berlin Wall moment for Sydney hospitality at the moment. You know, we're sort of a few days away from getting back, you know, into the restaurants and getting people back on the streets. So it's a really exciting time. It's been a busy. It's 100 days. It seems to have gone really quickly. It's been, you know, hard, but I mean, there's definitely harder things happening on the planet than this, I think.
You mentioned that there's been a lot of projects and you've been sort of pushing some aside and getting on top of others. How has your role changed in the group in the last year and a half as a result of what's happened?
Look, so I guess in February, 2020, I was group wine director for, you know, the Point Group and Icebergs and working with Morris closely. And at that time, I was looking to sort of funnel down my role to work with Morris, particularly because I had plans with my wife to buy a vineyard overseas and start to create a business overseas in Italy and sort of been doing a lot of work. And she'd been traveling, you know, she's a travel writer, so we'd been over there a lot. And we'd sort of started to funnel down to where we wanted to be. And then obviously, and then I had another project with Morgan McGlone and Annie, my wife, to create some parties around the world called Food Fight Club. And we're doing one in Copenhagen with Anders Selmar from Fiskerbar. And so all those things were just coming to a head. And then obviously the first sort of COVID lockdown happened and we sort of pushed things back. And it was proving really hard to try and, you know, look at a vineyard in Italy when we're here. We sort of, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty last year and, you know, about whether we wanted to do it still. I guess, you know, October this year, we're gearing up to do it still. We sort of changed to the south of France. We're looking sort of in the Luberon area now. And Morgan and Annie and I are still planning to do parties overseas. And we're on a Zoom call the other day trying to tee up some things to start happening in 22. So everything's been delayed, but I mean, as hard as it's definitely been, you know, mentally hard at times, I guess, for a lot of people, including myself. But I guess having those things sort of on the horizon and maybe feeling fortunate to have had so much time to reflect and be on your own, and especially for us as a couple, you know, with the children and myself, with Annie, it's been a really special time to be able to think about what we really want to do. And I guess for Icebergs, for me, you know, with Morris, that relationship's, you know, always strong, and I'm sort of really excited to sort of, you know, see Icebergs go into its 20th year, and you know, he comes in, you know, every week with a new idea and a new project, and he's a really creative person, so he certainly doesn't sleep while COVID's been keeping us locked down.
What's the feeling at the moment with the team at Icebergs? As you mentioned, everything's about to start to open up again, and there's a lot of anticipation. What's the feeling in the team?
Well, look, I think it's positive. I mean, the main management team, you know, General Manager Tasso Della Noce, the head chef Alex Pritchard, Gabrielle Webster's still there in the background. She's still recovering from that horrific accident that she had last year. But so the main team is there, and obviously Morris and Simone in events. So, but there's a nervousness, and but we feel pretty confident that there seems to be a clear picture. We're heading into summer, which should be a good time for both Bondi and Sydney generally. There's a lot of optimism in Sydney. I think about, hopefully that was, this is the last lockdown. I think there's pressure on businesses to find staff. There's a real lack of labour and people willing to work in hospitality, which is going to be a really ongoing issue. And there's definitely not a lack of demand. Icebergs is, bookings are phenomenally, we're overwhelmed with bookings, which is really great to see that there's a thirst for the venue. But there's definitely there's going to be some new pressures, I think, for restaurants that possibly weren't there before. And for me personally, working on the sort of the business side of it, there's how you deal with rent deferrals, how you deal with this, this pause of revenue, and how you make sure staff are sort of safe and got a great place to work. So it's going to be an interesting 12 months, but I think more so than last August when we opened, I think there's a lot more positivity around.
You've had a massive impact on the drinks and wine change in the last decade in Australia, but you're not one to seek the limelight. When did the interest in hospitality start for you?
Look, it goes a long way back for me because A, I'm old, and B, I've sort of done a lot of things over my career. Like I was a chef. Fighting to get a chef's hat. I was a sommelier trying to win Sommelier of the Year. I've worked as a professional trying to, win clients. So I've done a lot of things. I think for me, it's sort of sowed really early. My family, I'm from the UK. We came out here when I was quite young, but as a result of my parents, British citizens, but they met in Canada, had my eldest sister in Uruguay, moved from the south of England to the north of Queensland. So they've moved around a lot. So I've seen a lot of restaurants. I think I'd seen a lot of culture and different cultures at quite a young age, and I'm talking like 6, 7, 8. So I sort of had an idea of, how to, what a Le Pain au Chocolat was, and, crazy things like that at a very young age. And I guess at 12 years old, my parents sent each of us on a trip on our own somewhere in the world. Like my eldest sister went to Uruguay where she was born and stayed with a family, and my next sister was in in Dominican Republic, and I went to fortunately for me, went to Annecy in Haute-Savoie in France and stayed with the family for a summer, which was a winter, obviously, in the Northern Hemisphere. And the family were really into food. And so as a 12-year-old who'd sort of spent some time in, Townsville and then Noosa and Brisbane, it was a big change of pace being in a non-English speaking, in the French Alps. Instead of surfing, there were people skiing. It's kind of pre-snowboarding craze too because of my age. But so, I was exposed. I remember really clearly Bernard, the father, when the kids were at school, because I didn't go to school, taking me 40 minutes to a restaurant sort of outside Megève to eat trout, and we'd be skiing and eating cheeses like Beaufort, and him giving me a recipe to take to my mother for salad dressing, with, from Dijon, which is nearby. So I think that early age of seeing food, it was, and my mother's a phenomenal cook, grandmother's a phenomenal cook. We have we spend Christmases around a table. People argue about the Christmas pudding recipe. It was written in 1895 by my grandmother, and whether it's doubled. So we have a culture, a family culture that's very strong around food and travel. And I think that's sort of sowed the interest for me in food. And then I sort of went back to school after that, and I was at boarding school in Brisbane, and I had the opportunity when I finished school in my gap year, which we all had as kids. We could go somewhere we wanted to go and somewhere that they thought that would be, good for our growth as people. So before I went to Sydney University, I had a year, and my first 6 months was in central India in Madhya Pradesh, in near Bhopal in Indore, and I sort of learnt a bit of Hindi and sort of immersed. Yeah, mujhe thoda Hindi aati hai. It's not. I apologise to any Hindi listeners. It's been a while, but the speaking listeners. So I think that time again, it's like that unsettled me from more of a corporate trajectory, and I sort of still went back to Sydney University and studied and completed degrees. But that time in India really sort of changed, me from somewhere that's been in a post-BLQ Peterson sort of southeast Queensland bubble into central India. it's a pretty it's a pretty big change, and again then food. You know, you go to Goa with its Portuguese influence, or Gujarat, or in the south, and you're seeing those different foods, and you notice it. I mean, you can't help but notice if you're in Kerala, the food's different to you're in Kashmir, and I guess Indian food is so strong. It's another place that really influenced my interest in food. And then I guess there's a long way around. So then I went back to university, completed my degree, and then at the end of that, sort of started to work in a more sort of corporate trajectory, as I said, and then had this light bulb moment when a friend from Noosa said, "Hey, there's a opening in the kitchen this summer. You should come up and hang out, and we'll just reminisce about old times and surf a bit." And I went up there and started cooking, and that was it. I never stopped, and then until I found wines, some 20 years later. But it was a lot, that sort of early period. I think travel, food, and culture. But once you travel and you're exposed to travel and have parents or an environment where you're exposed to it, you automatically you're interested in food because it changes. It changes so much where you are geographically and the people, the cultures that you're with.
Let's have a look at your chefing career. Was there any key moments that you can tell us about that really changed the trajectory for you as a chef?
Yeah, look, so I'd been in Noosa, and obviously I'd studied and completed a degree, and I'd sort of had, I sort of started an apprenticeship in Noosa, went to Nambour TAFE, which is a huge change of pace from Sydney Uni, and talking about economics law and sitting in Merewether building, arguing with lecturers. But I enjoyed it just as much, and so I'd been there, and I suddenly started to realise, wow, if I want to make this, I'm starting late. I've got to work with some good people, and I've got to travel. I've got to get overseas. I've got to, find something. So growing up, my mum had a book called The Great Chefs of France, which is an amazing book by Anthony Blake, I think, and Quentin Crew from memory. And there was I sort of tried to seek out the Australian equivalent, and there was one at the time called, I think, 21 Great Chefs of Australia. So I sort of went through there and sort of looked at the people in that book, and one of them, fortunately for me, was called Danny Chouet, who was a chef at Cleopatra, which was a two-hat sort of French restaurant in Blackheath. And she was for me, fortunately, I sort of sent a letter to her, and fortunately she took me on as a pastry chef, which despite having zero qualifications, apart from a session with my mum and my nephews in the kitchen trying to make puff pastry before I took the train up there for the job interview. But that 2 years, I mean, she was from the Dordogne. She cooked really wonderful French food, country cooking, and that sort of Elizabeth David sort of, when you read, just beautiful, simple, elegant country cooking. And that really shaped me and gave me the confidence. And that was a big starting point to really, wow, I can do things. Then I went and worked overseas at some places and travelled and came back, and I sort of worked at a place called Buzo, which was owned by some different people. And during that time there, I got offered a job by John Wilson, who's he used to have a smoked salmon company. He's done catering. I think he's based in Tokyo now, but he's a really important part of the Sydney food scene, I think, that probably didn't get heralded as much as maybe mainstream people knew. But he gave me an opportunity to be the head chef of a restaurant which was in the old Paramount site where Christine Mansfield was, called Osteria Moana. And I took that job as the head chef and worked with a woman named Anne Taylor, who's a phenomenal chef who had I don't remember the restaurant, but it was an important restaurant in Australia in the 80s. And so I worked with her as the head chef there. And again, we got a chef's hat, and I was, young, and that I just felt really alive. And he was really into paring back food and being really, Italian food at its core, and serving an artichoke if an artichoke was great. I think his confidence and vision really rubbed off as me as a cook. So that was that was a big moment for me. And at that time too, I'd started to sort of drink wine and understand wine, and particularly Italian wine. So there's a lot going on. And then we opened up some businesses. I did with Todd Garrett, who's still one of my favourite chefs in Australia, and Tracy Trinder. And we did Buzo and then Wine Library. And so it's through that time I cooked. But as sort of, around 2008, I started to really sort of chase the wine, the starting to study wine, and that drive started to overtake the cooking. I was really fortunate to work with a lot of great chefs, and I think coming from a cooking background made wine really interesting because I looked at it through a very different lens, I guess, to people who just start out as sommeliers. No better or worse, just different.
Let's have a look at Wine Library. It arrived at a time when things were changing in Sydney. There was small bar licenses up for grabs, and the city started to change with smaller venues. And Wine Library made a huge impact. Tell us about what it was like and the momentum and interest it received.
Look, for me, it was life-changing because it introduced me to now what are some of my best friends. It introduced me to a style of wine and an understanding of wine that didn't happen. It was a really free place. It was really, it was not uncommon to be there till 5, 6 in the morning. Don't tell the licensing police, it was all legit. But we just drinking with friends and talking. I remember going to 121 BC, which was another great bar with Giorgio de Maria, and we'd sit there talking all night about wine and ringing people in Europe and planning trips. And Joel Amos, who's now at Drinks, we'd be sitting in the bar, and then we'd book to go to London. We went to London for 4 days, to a wine fair and flew back. So it was a really exciting group of people, as much as that, that sort of brought that thinking about wine and sustainable wine and organic farming and things to Sydney. And Mike Benny, it was a really exciting bar, and it was for me, that those first few years there I learnt so much off so many people, sommeliers like, Anders Selma, Mads, all these people coming through from around the world and just sitting there drinking, talking and learning. And we're very fortunate in Sydney to have had people, great importers like Andrew Gard and Dan Clark. There's 100 Tim Stock. There's all these amazing importers that had been here that had these wines, and then just have this forum which was just fun and loose, and open a bottle and share a plate of food. It was a really exhilarating time, I guess, for me, and I certainly learnt a phenomenal amount in a very short space of time.
This episode is proudly supported by OpenTable.
Nearly 1/3 of diners are booking same day. So they're making those decisions on the spot. And 10% are making their bookings within just a few hours. And so it's why it's so important to have booking software like OpenTable, which allows your diners to discover you. And so when restaurants are on platforms like OpenTable, they're much more likely to be discovered. We help diners to connect to restaurants. Ultimately, using technology helps you to reattach to those diners.
Experience the power of OpenTable. For an exclusive offer, visit restaurant.opentable.com.au/DITW. Wine can be quite intimidating for a lot of people, and they rely on experts like you to guide them through it. But what makes a great wine experience?
It's really personal. And so like with lockdown, a lot of people you'll see sitting down with like little tasters of little, pharmacy bottles of wine, 7 in a row, all labelled from winemakers, and doing tastings and tasting through them, and they get satisfaction from that. For me, it's when a wine resonates the place it's from. So like when I found like Barolo is a great example where I sort of discovered it around 2003. It wasn't to be found, but I visited Barolo in 2003 and I had no idea about wine, and I started to taste the place, and I started to, with the great producers there, you start to understand that this is from this place. And if that wine, that flavour resonates with you, the deeper you go into it, the more profound that sort of experience becomes. So for me, what makes a wine great is if it reflects the place, it reflects the person who made it. And I think there's more and more wines coming available in Australia that have that are maybe less made by a company that just bangs out things to a recipe of sorts. I know all wines, but they're not controlled. They reflect the season. They reflect the place. So those wines are the ones I think that for me that are great.
You were involved with some other people to create Rootstock, a huge event. Tell us about how that came about and what it was like pulling that together.
Well, look, it became like a festival with up to 10,000 people through the door. So it was an amazing journey. It was collaborative. I mean, there were 5 of us that started it. I mean, it started with Mike, Giorgio and I, Giorgio De Maria and Mike Benny, talking about it and then thinking about a place, and then we joined up with Matt Young and Linda Wiss and Joel Amos and heaps of other people, and it snowballed. But whilst there were 5 of us in there was literally thousands of people over the 5 years involved that made it. We were just lucky to be holding on to the reins at some points of it, but it ran its kind of self. It was truly, I mean, the lineup of chefs, if you look back on that came through it, the lineup of winemakers, of First Nations people that lectured and talked and spoke at that thing, from Magnus Nielsen to Uncle Bruce Pascoe, Ben Shuri, so many big names, but along with so many smaller names that people didn't know, and producers that were found. It was a really special to be involved with it, and it was 5 years that I don't think it can be repeated, because it was just such a moment in time and sort of an awakening of, particularly for wine, of produce and where it comes from.
Italian food and wine has run a thread through your career. What is your interest with Italian, all things Italian?
I guess I went there. I visited there a lot, and I'm intending to visit there a lot next year if I can get in. It's just I mean, I like the simplicity. I like that it's 1, 2, 3, 4 ingredients. It's seasonal. At the moment, my wife's growing cauliflower, so we've got a little kitchen garden, and seeing those things grow and just come up, harvest and dress with olive oil, treat them simply. It just touches me. So I don't need to break it down, change the shape of it, cook it with ash. I just like that. I like that the transparency of Italian cooking, that it sort of shows what's behind it.
What sort of impact has the last year and a half had on you? I know you had plans to go overseas, but has it changed your views of the industry and what you might do?
It definitely has. Like I always want to be involved in the Sydney restaurant landscape, in some capacity. But it's really made me realise that for me, I love Sydney and I love the community, but I really miss being overseas. I miss for what I do, tasting wine. Like, as I said, I can't do it on a Zoom call, tasting blind. I'm not someone who wants to try 300 wines under alfoil. I want to stand in the vineyard and talk to the person who makes it. And like the areas I like, Jura, the Barolo, Piemonte, Beaujolais. I like to be there and to meet the person, to stand in the vineyard. So it's really confirmed to me that Annie and I's decision to get a vineyard and have, for my children and her children to have a place to stay when they're traveling in Europe, to have a base in Europe for her travel writing, and for me a tasting base, but always to come back here. It's made me realise that that's much more important. I mean, I knew it was important to me, but now I feel like it's definitely the direction I want to be in.
Wine experiences have underpinned what you do. Has there been any great wine experiences that you've had in Australia that you can share?
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, from a festival point of view, outside of Rootstock, Joel Amos and I did last year. This is a personal one rather than a winemaker one to start, but we did a festival called Huge Moves, which was just before COVID, the second COVID out, the lockdown in Sydney, and just that feeling of being in a room with 40 producers, people, guests who love wine, with music playing. That was a really powerful moment for me, because it made me realise how many great Australian producers there are, and how much Australian wine, like seeing those guys for the first time, for many of them in a year, standing in a room, tasting through their wines, listening to music, eating great food, that really resonated with me. So I guess collectively Australian wine, that's a moment. In terms of a producer, there's so many, and it's dangerous to single one out, but because I know so many people. But Michael Dillon, I think, at Bindi Wines, is making wines that earlier I was talking about place and people that really resonate his patch of land, his family. It resonates what he's interested in, and whilst for me I'm not drawn as much as I used to towards Pinot, Chardonnay and more conventional styles, he's someone who makes them speak and sing a very different frequency. So visiting his winery some years ago for the first time and tasting through his cellar, walking around his close planted vineyard, hearing the history of his father and his family and what they're about, that was a really powerful moment. I mean, one of many in Australia, but that's the first that came to mind.
Reopening is looming. What are the biggest challenges of reopening?
Look, I think it's customer expectation, and I guess there's a lot of the vaccination is a hot topic, and people's understanding of it. I mean, from the restaurant's point of view, for instance, Icebergs, we're just following health orders. But I guess managing that's a new thing that we have to deal with. Normally you deal with someone arriving at a restaurant who's had a bad day or going through a breakup or getting engaged or getting married. This time you've got to check them both. They have to check into the venue, then they have to check their booking, then they have to prove they're vaccinated, then they've got to wear a mask. There's a lot of things that maybe that first sort of 6 weeks until December the 1st when things loosen up, that's going to be kind of new and a challenge just to make the experience enjoyable, because as you know with Morris, the guest experience and people feeling at ease and treated with care and respect, that's going to be an interesting challenge for all hospitality and also for guests, when they arrive. It's just different. Thankfully, hopefully, it won't be for too long.
Restaurants have been forced to adapt and change, and many people have been affected in the industry over the last year and a half. Do you think there'll be a different hospitality offering as we open up again? Do you think the industry will change because of this?
Yeah, I think I do. I think on a lot of levels it'll be different. I think people like every hospitality venue in New South Wales and Victoria would be carrying more debt and more pressure. There's no way someone could have been. There'd be the very small minority that have been better off because of this. Maybe some that have takeaway elements that have blown up. But in general, there's going to be staff and venues that are carrying more pressure, directors and owners of businesses carrying more pressure. So I think that's going to create an environment that could be better. Maybe people will make it the booking process, the offering a bit more succinct and direct. I think wine lists perhaps should be, in the general, except for the few that are cashed up, will probably shrink down and become a bit more focused and specialised. People will hopefully lower that, have to fight back to pay off some of the debts, to landlords, etc. So I think there will be changes. I think it's going to be an interesting 12 months for business. I mean, I think the good thing is, from all reports around town, and I know a few people around, I booked in at Fratelli Paradiso, I booked in at Margaret, I booked in at a number of places around town, and everyone's busy. So that's good that people are going to be out. So that's going to really help the opening. But there's definitely obstacles.
You mentioned how much you love Sydney and that you'll always be tied to it. What is it that you love about the Sydney restaurant scene?
Well, I think, it's diverse, and I've really realised, I'm fortunate to be in an LGA that has Josh Nyland and Victor Churchill, but that, as good as that is, not having Thai Town, not having Chinatown, not having Cabramatta, not having Bow, all these places that the diversity of offering of food in Sydney, the mix of levels of from three hat to Hong Ha. There's just a great broadness of how we eat and accessibility that doesn't necessarily involve a set menu at $350 a head, but if you want that's there too. I think it's a very it's really made me realize how much I travel around the city to get what I want, and being in a one LGA or one 5K area has really realised how much I miss. From its Haymarket is a great one that springs to mind. Newtown, there's such different there's such different offerings that in such and so diverse, which make it, I think it's really special like that, Sydney, and at a very high level. Like Thai food in Sydney, as you know, it's phenomenal. Chinese food, phenomenal. Like it's a very fortunate city from a food point of view.
You've had an incredible influence in the kitchen and in the front of house and on the drinking expectations of people in Sydney. What is it that you love about what you do?
For me, it's people. I mean, I love people. The friends I've met, both who customers, who've professional industry professionals, front of house, back of house, suppliers. It's meeting people. I love the thing I love most is becoming friends with people, whether it's sitting over a bar, sitting in a restaurant, serving a customer, doing business with other restaurateurs, doing business with suppliers. It's the friendships and the things that come out of those. Like the amount of trips. Like people, Giorgio is a great example. Someone I've been overseas with, 4 or 5 times now, traveling that I didn't know. 10 years ago, or I probably just knew him 10 years ago, but met through wine. It's become a really close friend. Those things. I mean, my wife, I met, Icebergs was doing an event with Anthony Huckstep and Rolando Shirato at in Los Angeles, and I met my wife. So that's life-changing. So I think the people for me is the thing I love the most. Showing people wine that I love and finding producers and being able to tell people the story in a way that's not, this is 10% this and 5% that and 5 this. And I like just telling someone a little bit about the place, a little bit about the style, a little bit, for me, giving people knowledge that's probably from quite a different angle to most sommeliers I really enjoy, and trying to tell people the story of that person over time. Like Tom Schaubrook's a great example of his wines have evolved so much since I've known him, and taking customers on that journey of his journey has been really enjoyable for me. So it's people again, it's the winemakers as much as the wine.
Well, James, we're just moments away from you opening the doors again at Icebergs. How is that going to feel?
Well, it's going to feel pretty amazing. I mean, we've been in there a little bit. We're in there in full force next week. But as exciting as that, I've got to be honest, is we open on Friday the 15th. But on the 11th, the Nelson Hotel in Bondi Junction opens, and I intend to stand on the corner at the TAB end of the Oval Bar, order a schooner of Rishas and catch up with a few people I haven't seen for at least 101 days. So that's something I look forward to. I mean, I think Icebergs being open and seeing staff who've been, people have been, we all have struggled to get back out there and get dropped into a Bondi summer that I'm really excited about. I mean, I think summer in Bondi this year feels like it's going to be pretty special. And the menus and the wine lists and things are tuned up and the staff are ready to go. So it's going to be, and Morris, one thing, as everyone knows, Morris Tazzini won't let those doors open unless it's singing. So it's going to be fun.
Well, James, it's been an honour to have you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear just a part of your story. Good luck on the 15th and good luck on the 11th at the Nelson as well. Please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks very much for having me. Much appreciated.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.